Hi, guys, and welcome to another 7-minute lecture. Riots and unrest in South Africa. I'm sure many of you have heard of it already, that there's been significant rioting, looting, arson, and violence that's broken out in many parts of South Africa. What caused all this, and what are the obstacles currently preventing the return of law and order? Those are the issues that we're discussing today. So, the protest initially began when the former South African president Jacob Zuma was sent to jail. There was an investigation that was ongoing about alleged corruption during his regime, and he refused to attend the inquiries even when he was summoned. So the court slapped him with contempt of court charges for about 15 months. And almost immediately, his supporters took to the streets demanding for his release. However, in just a couple of days, these protests morphed into something else entirely. You can't really call what's happening there protests, because you can't call many of the people involved protesters, because what's happening right now is a systematic campaign of robbing and looting. Thousands of businesses and shops have been broken into and plundered. Nearly 100 people have already died from the violence, and it only looks like the number will keep increasing. And what makes it worse is that many of the rioters are coming in from other areas to do the rioting and the looting. So it has regional ramifications within the country as well. Many are calling it the worst case of violence South Africa has seen since the end of apartheid nearly 30 years ago. It's going to lead to food shortages all over South Africa as well. One of the port cities, for instance, Durban, is one of the worst affected by the violence. So this is going to disrupt supply chains throughout the country, because Durban is where many of the imports land. So let's look at some of the key issues and controversies that have sprung up here. Firstly, are these protests or riots? I just said a moment ago that I didn't feel they should be called protesters, but you certainly can if you define protests differently. The South African opposition parties, for example, are still calling these protests, and they've even gone on record saying that the South African government shouldn't act too harshly against the people who are doing this, because they're just protesters. So, for example, South Africa has now brought in the army to control the violence. Something like 25,000 soldiers have been deployed in order to quieten things down. The opposition parties are against this, and they've already started arguing that the army should not be used for internal violence like this. But of course, there's also another group, in fact, that seems to be most of the country at the moment, that's of the opinion that the government hasn't done enough to control the violence, that it took too long to call in the army, and that the government should be stronger on these protesters. The current president is already facing a lot of criticism that nothing was done initially. This could be because he wanted to pacify the supporters of the former president. It could have been done in the hope that the protests would fizzle out in a couple of days. But whatever it was a miscalculation, because this thing has morphed into a huge monster that's now too big for the government to control immediately. They have managed to enforce some law and order in some places, but most affected areas remain affected. People have also been saying, hey, where's our state intelligence? Why didn't they warn us? Because some sections of the rioters did organize the violence quite openly online, where they even said that they were going to make the country ungovernable. The state intelligence mechanisms have been completely ineffective in terms of warning against these forces, or even tracking these guys and catching them. The economic angle is also another important line we need to look at here. We've got to remember that even though apartheid was lifted in 1994, the economic conditions of South Africa have only gotten worse, not better. About 33% of the workforce is unemployed. Remember, that's not 1 in 3 people overall. That's just 1 in 3 people among the workforce, among the people who are capable of working. So overall, it's possible that 1 in 2 people in the country are without a job. And this is even worse among the youth. Imagine living in a country where half the population doesn't have a way to feed itself, and most of these guys are young. That's not a good situation at all. The ANC, the African National Congress, which has ruled South Africa for a long time now, has done nothing over the last 30 years to improve the lives of the local blacks even after apartheid ended. Most of the income in the country is still disproportionately shared. Access to infrastructure, access to public resources, a lot of stuff like that still sees huge racial disparities when we look at the numbers. The assumption was always that once the local Africans were in power and not these evil white people, then the lives of ordinary blacks would improve as well, which is why there was so much hope after the apartheid regime was dismantled. The assumption, though, has turned out to be a complete farce because these local governments now seem to care even less about the local South Africans than any white invader did. The pandemic hasn't helped things either. Most people have been locked up for a long time, and that's been a huge contributor to the bad economic situation as well. But on top of the economics, it's the psychology as well. Making large masses of people stay indoors for long periods of time is just not practical, and it often leads to tense situations where they find other outlets. If this pandemic has taught us anything, it's that during a worldwide pandemic, it might be better for the people to just stay indoors. But given all that, the people will not stay indoors, even if you tell them to. You can't just give regular citizens the feeling that they are caged up. It's always a powder keg waiting to go off, regardless of whether scientifically they are right or not. Especially when there are economic and racial dimensions to all this trouble. So overall, I think public opinion in South Africa is firmly in favor of ending these riots with force if necessary. That's where we are now. Even though there are political actors here and there sympathetic to the violence, ordinary people are never in favor of stuff like this because they have jobs to do, they have shops to run, they have responsibilities, bills to pay. So they rarely have time for protesters thinking that they are ushering in some kind of new revolutionary era. The violence right now will probably continue for a bit longer, but some progress is being made. The government can hopefully get things under control, because if it doesn't, we might be witnessing political changes in South Africa that we haven't witnessed since independence. If you like content like this, please don't forget to share and subscribe. Thank you, take care, and I'll see you soon.